Ready to jump into Union Arena with Sword Art Online, but don't know where to start? Well, don't worry, because in today's video, I'm going to give you 6 different deck lists to get started with, whether you're a new player just jumping in, or you're an experienced player, because spoiler, we just got our first regional confirmed for Union Arena, which will qualify you for Nats and eventually lead to Worlds as well. So this is a great time to be jumping in. Now, I will say up front, because this set is coming out a little bit later than when it did in the Japan launch, it doesn't have that same punching power that we might have expected if you followed the game initially, but it can still hold its own and has a couple surprises. So with that out of the way, let's dig into these decks that you absolutely need to know about. But right before we get into that, I do want to stress something up front. Yes, I did mention that some of these deck lists might not hit as hard as we've seen previously in the Japan meta. However, if you fast forward a little bit and know where it's at in today's Japanese Union Arena market, is that Shinon is absolutely insane in the set. It still remains a very popular deck in Japan to play and get ready and be excited for. And then the other deck that's called Ordinary Scales, and again, as I mentioned in my other video, I'm not as up to date on Sword Art Online, but the purple deck that we get in Volume 2 is apparently just insane. And truth be told, I know it's not the most popular take and things that we've seen so far, but it might be the second deck to really get hit if it arrives too early in the North American market, just because of how insanely strong it is right now in Japan. So at least for the future, I think green is very safe. It's very good now. Spoiler, I think it is the best Sword Art Online deck. So if you are a competitive player, you need to go buy this deck today before it goes up any more in price. And then with Volume 2, it is going to get even more buffs, as well as another deck that is going to be extremely competitively viable, extremely competitive focused, that you will want to keep an eye on this set. Now, again, there might be changes, there might be other improvements later down the road. We are getting things like Full Metal Alchemist very soon. It's in Japan already. We are getting things like the Ronin Kenshin set, which is going to be new as well. That might change the meta even more. Right, a lot more to kind of just add disclaimers to or talk about in the future, but I did at least want to address up front that where does this deck sit in a future meta, or where does the overall Volume 2 impact? And it is absolutely something that you are going to want to prepare for, much like Bleach Volume 2 is going to be a very strong deck. But with that out of the way, let's talk about these 6 different Volume 1 decks so you can get ready for those regionals. So up first, we have the Asuna and Kirito deck, right? Really just the poster child of Sword Art Online. Obviously, most of 2 important characters. So, of course, we got to talk about them first and talk about their switch mechanic, which, for those who have been playing Union Arena for a little bit already, if you played Demon Slayer Yellow, or even some of the Speed of Sound Sonic Red deck from One Punch Man, it has that same attack from the back line, do multiple attacks in a turn style of feel to it. So, this is going to be more of your aggressive deck style, getting in that very early pressure, which on the other hand can have some troubles closing out game if you can't find the extra switch or the double attacks. But this will be one that if you like the more aggressive styles, or maybe you just want an upgrade or side grade to Demon Slayer Yellow but want a little bit more options to play at locals, then this is absolutely a deck that you can pick up. One of the key cards that we do got to stress is the 5 Kirito up front here, which gives you the flexibility in moving around your cards. Again, moving things from the back line or energy line to the front line and back and forth and vice versa is going to be a key part of the deck. So in terms of the overall engine to bring it all together, getting that online and making sure that you're stringing together a bunch of 4K attacks is going to be very, very important. Now, the other thing to note here as well with the Asuna, just making sure that you can get the extra BP with these switches, or you're getting the impact or the draw off the other SR, right? All these do need to be streamlined and comboed together with one of the various Kirito style of cards. So we have the movers in the 3 energy with the color trigger. We have the 5 energy that I mentioned that can do it as well. And then, of course, with the ability to move it after the attack, right, is just another way that happens in combat. So there is a little bit more planning that you need to do with this style of deck. It's not just your straightforward all-in aggressive dump your hand strategy. It does actually require a little bit more planning. However, one of the downsides I will note compared to some of the other aggressive decks that we've seen already in Union Arena, when it comes to like extra draw or extra filtering, it does lack a little bit, especially when we just got the powerhouse, which is this Speed of Sound Sonic red aggressive strategy that has the Boros, has the extra filtering and drawing. It really just goes to show how much we've seen just these kind of side upgrades or side power creeps and just the power gain that you get from having just one or two extra cards that give you that piece of consistency, especially in a best of one game. That is just so important. So overall, I think this is still a pretty strong deck for what it wants to be doing. It can be the absolute high roll deck for getting those extra attacks in early that your opponent just can't come back from, but it does lack a little bit of consistency pieces overall, in my opinion, compared to some of the other sets that we have, especially with Demon Slayer getting its binder promo, the One Punch Man red deck that I mentioned. So for a competitive player, you're going to want to know especially how this operates, and knowing that not having the Asuna on the board is one of the weaker points of the deck. But from a more competitively viable standpoint, yes, it can still top. Would not be surprised if this wins an event, but there are other potentially more competitive options that you can still pick from. Moving on from there, we have the Leafa bounce deck, and this one is just absolutely fun to play. This entire deck revolves around bouncing your own cards to generate extra value and making sure you have 5 cards in hand to activate the various effects of your cards or various conditions that you need to meet. So you do get to play cards like the World Tree, which helps as both a bouncer as well as a BP booster, which can be one of the downsides of the deck, with Leafa needing to make sure that she has 5 cards to get up to the can't be blocked part. And then you have other ways to boost her BP to make sure that she's attacking, or some of your other cards that get stuck at 3k. But it is another card that if it's on the front line, you have to return another card to activate its BP boost to then replay the things like the Yui, which allows you to search for extra cards and draw extra cards. So this is a deck that really wants to focus on knowing exactly what turn you can get that extra AP draw, because every single card possible that you can have in your hand or drawing extra can be really important in bringing this all together. And that's where the 3/2 Asuna really is a MVP card, because it does allow you to get extra cards out onto the battlefield, making sure that you're finding extra pieces that you can then balance with, again, either the Leafa or the World Tree site, just to be creating more value over time. So playing extra cards for free is also another key aspect of this deck, and that is why we get to play the 2 Energy Elizabeth, which just says when played, draw a card. So this does give us a few more draw options in terms of just increasing the consistency of the deck overall compared to the other blue deck. It allows us to have a couple more filtering options as well with the Yui, the 3 energy version. However, this is one that can feel a little bit awkward if you don't find the right pieces or if you don't meet the right conditions. It doesn't have as much aggressive power as the blue Kirito deck that we had just talked about previously. So this one does require a little bit more work. When it sees its pieces, it is scary strong, and I have a versus video which we're going to showcase. Hopefully it's up by Friday if I have time to edit and all that stuff, where when Leafa gets its start, it is crazy strong with how fast it can come out of the gate and start swinging, but it does rely on hitting some very specific pieces in the late game, or else it will just suffer a little bit. This is a deck that does get a noticeable bump in Volume 2 as well. However, Volume 2, I should have mentioned up front, is not confirmed just yet, so we have to wait and see when that's going to happen. But again, if you are someone who likes a more traditional blue style of deck, right, where the Kirito is, it's probably blue just because it looked better on the cards, but the Kirito deck is really just aggressive strategy, right? We have the red One Punch Man deck, the yellow Demon Slayer deck, and now the blue Sword Art Online deck, which all are kind of similar feeling and similar themes, other than like the color triggers being the key difference. But in terms of the actual like bounce effects and normally what blue wants to be doing, the blue Leafa deck really gives you that kind of blue UA feel and really leans back into more of its color identity and plays with it in a kind of more interesting way. As we've seen in other decks in the past that are maybe more about locking down your opponent's board or bouncing your opponent's board, like blue JJK, this one is more focused on bouncing your own things for a typical value, and of course getting various ways to BP boost to make sure you're manipulating the battlefield so your opponent either can't block, or you're boosting your own characters large enough so that they can swing over what they want to be doing. Again, the other kind of huge disclaimer that we have to add here is for the number of 4K attackers that you have, compared to every other Union Arena deck, right? We literally just have the Kirito. Leafa is a condition-based one, and while we do have multiple ways that we can boost it up and make sure that we're hitting that 4K threshold, it really is just Kirito hitting that line. And of course, when you're also thinking about all the 5K style of decks that we have in the current meta, this can feel a little bit lackluster in terms of just the offensive power that you get to push through when you really need it, that you're then having to string together multiple combos and really doing big plays to get those effects, right? And so we do have the effects to, change the battlefield, maybe get multiple world tree, and then you're manipulating BPs that way. But it does feel a little bit bad to find those paths if you don't have the conditions met with Leafa or the other cards that can allow you to change the conditions for when they can block. So again, this is definitely a deck that is not at all as straightforward as some of the more aggressive strategies that we're going to see in this set, but it is something that is different enough, and I think it's very fun that if you have it's also very cheap for this one, if you want to play something a little bit differently than the blue Leafa or the blue ALO style from this sort of online deck can be really good. Moving on from there, one that at least surprised me when I've seen it kind of play out and put together is the Yuuki and Asuna deck. So we do have a more aggressive green style of deck, as well as the more late game or mid-range style we have in the Shinon deck. But the Yuuki deck is all about kind of switching it up from what green wants to be doing, and not to just keep playing on that pun, but one thing I have noticed in this set in particular is that the color identity does feel like it's something a little bit different. And what I mean by that is this green deck resolves all around having certain cards in your sideline, which is very traditional purple style of thing in Union Arena. And while we don't have as much dedicated, perhaps, mill compared to what we've seen in the purple Union Arena decks, the one energy Ichigo that can mill a card being the kind of staple example I know a lot of people would go to, the Yuuki deck is really about playing cards for free to your front line, blocking with them, getting some type of effect for having them go to the sideline, and then slowly building that up to get the more aggressive engines going. Now, the one thing I will say about this deck in particular, we are adding in the Sleeping Knights package just for the sake of, again, getting to play an extra card for free, and it also counts for one of the conditions of the cards of if you have a Sleeping Knights on your field. But this is one that I think, again, there's a couple pieces that we want to see really upgraded with Volume 2, and Sleeping Knights is absolutely one of the cards that you can cut pretty much immediately in that regard in terms of what we can look forward to. But for where it lines in, because it wants to be a more aggressive style that just also happens to have a late game payoff, I think Sleeping Knights can be a key option here in terms of just getting down those more aggressive lines to chip in that early damage. Now, Yuuki, again, is going to allow you to draw the extra cards. It is a 2 action point card, but really important to note here is that it does have that 4K BP threshold. So because it gets set to active, you're going to get to swing if it is a 4K body. So it's usually going to check for damage or take something out. But then when it's sidelined, it has a similar Nanami effect that you get to switch something to resting. So this is actually really interesting in the current meta, especially when we think about One Punch Man and all the damage to style effects, right? This basically is just going to, you want to block with it because it's going to get sidelined, right? And you are going to now be able to prevent potentially 3 to 4 damage, depending on what their board looks like, that one is filling its own condition for the Asuna that wants to have more of these cards in your sideline, and it also helps you stabilize when you really need it. So you are really focused, again, on building up, seeing those specials, seeing the Yukis that can get sidelined. Again, Yuuki just being great because you can draw one and then sideline a card as well, right? So draw, discard, and then the Asuna being kind of the key finisher, but it does require a little bit more of that late game payoff. But again, we do have similar cards that are just okay to attack with. And then, of course, we have the other 4 energy Yuuki here down at the bottom, which does care about the Sleeping Knights. Again, just another card to make sure you're meeting its condition that allows you to draw one and discard one as well. So again, we do have a bit of draw and discarding built in to this style of deck. It doesn't have, unfortunately, maybe the self-mill that we've seen as much. We do have the 3 energy silica here as mentioned, but it really is more about a draw, discard, and playing cards to get extra draws and discards, kind of going and slowly building up your sideline that way. So if you are someone who maybe like the Garo deck is another good example of this from One Punch Man, and just slowly building up your sideline to get these cards in this typical payoff, where it's going to be a little bit more aggressive of a green style deck compared to what we've seen otherwise in Union Arena. I definitely think this is an interesting one to keep an eye out for. And with a couple tweaks, I think this can be a very powerful deck list that is definitely going to win some rare battles at a minimum, but I think will have some surprise wins or surprise tops when we think about the larger events overall. Now, the deck that I got to give it up for, the deck that is going to terrorize everybody for the foreseeable future, is the Shinon and Kirito deck. This deck just has absurd amounts of board control. It has absurd amounts of filtering and consistency pieces. And in a best of 1 game, this is just peak, right? Obviously, with One Punch Man, they have the ability to just have higher BP, so they are a little bit safe from it. But the amount of snipe that you're getting for board control elements and the damage too that you're getting off the Kirito and slowly building up, as well as just the other Kirito that is going to be drawing you extra cards. I mean, there's just so much pressure that you can apply with this style of deck. And one card I really have to give it up for as well that I didn't have in my initial build, but I'm definitely thinking about adding back in now, is the Photon Sword, because just the sheer amount of forcing a battle that this deck can do to make sure that Kirito's effect is online, you can set this up that you are always going to have a damage to impact to effect to end the game. And that is a very strong thing to be doing. So I think with that case, there might be you might go up to a 3rd copy of Photon Sword and maybe even cut a copy of Barbecue, because generally you are just going to be spending your hand very quickly, that you're not going to need the final triggers to pay the extra action points, especially when you're doing all the filtering with Kirito. But again, getting the damage to impact to end the game, as well as having a 5k body that is then also sticky because it forces your opponent to discard an extra card if they remove it. I mean, this deck just does so much. And again, Shinon, when you play it, is going to get the snipe for the turn. Whenever you get to win a battle, you're also doing more filtering, and then you're also giving 1,000 BP boost, again, namely to the 4 energy Kirito, so it can draw you an extra card. But there are also, some 3Ks that we want to be playing and boosting and promoting to the front line to make sure that we're still hitting that 4K or 5K BP threshold. So there's just so much BP boosting that you can do in this deck. And as I was playing a game, I actually didn't see a lot of the Shinon raids. I saw just the Kirito, and I was just able to use Kirito's buff effect to pump the 4 energy Kirito, making sure it's consistently drawing an extra card, making sure that we're having 5k attackers. And shocker, that is enough to win games on its own. When you're also filtering in the 2 energy Shinon, which I also kept forgetting that this has the when played effect to, filter when needed. There's so many ways that we can line up, a 3K, it has step, put it to the front line, let it swing for 4K for a turn, and then if we really need to, put it back on the energy line to produce that, 6th or 7th energy that we need so we can go back into our other raid targets. So for a deck that just has an insane amount of board control with also consistency, this is a deck that if it didn't have snipe, it really feels like a blue deck for just how much insane amount of drawing and consistency that it has. That I am in no way surprised that this is a terror that it is in the Japan format. But what did surprise me is I vividly remember when this deck came out, or when this set came out in Japan, everybody rated this as a tier 2 or tier 3 deck. And I could not disagree more at this point where it sits in the current meta. And yes, we are in a more control heavy meta, so I think that does play a role. But this deck, because you are, able to trade board and then also do filtering, so you're able to find your removal at a higher consistency rate or higher draw rate than your opponent, you are going to come out ahead the vast majority of those matches that are more control focused. So I was really surprised to see how low this is rated. And then volume 2, it just gets even more support, which really kicks it up a notch. That it is, again, one that I think you should invest into if you are a more competitive player for Union Arena. You should buy this deck today before the SRs go up anymore when Volume 2 eventually drops. But it is one that we'll have to wait and see how popular it is and how people approach it, because I do think this is, not the perfect list. Again, these are all starter lists that I would recommend. I focus very heavily on a bunch of 4-ofs just to get people into the game, but with some, tweaking and finding the right numbers, I think this deck is going to be an absolute staple and be another benchmark that other decks have to compete against. Again, I cannot stress enough, this deck is insane. Lastly, getting into yellow, we have 2 different decks, and this is, again, where it feels a little different. It feels like they are really switching up what the element wants to look like or what the color wants to look like, because the theme or element of this deck is really about heavy 4K attacks with extra removal baked in, which really reminds me a lot more of like Purple Bleach. Now we have removal versus the reduction, and it does require a little bit more of a setup, but ultimately this is a deck that just wants to have a bunch of 4K swinging bodies that also get removal, and that's where we see Alice, which can get up to a 4,000 or 4K removal. Yes, it is a 5 energy, that's where is like the one handicap is, as well as having the extra requirements where the purple Ichigo deck was all about just having cards from your sideline and spending them. But in this one, it is relatively easy to meet those conditions. We were just getting a 4K nuke off the body. Again, the one small caveat I will say, if we continue to go into this more board control heavy style of meta, this does get a lot worse, which is why I did rate it lower in my review, which we'll talk about at the end. But it is still something that I think that from a overall, aggressive mid-range style of deck that can just slam a bunch of 4K bodies and get a couple extra removals or get impact very easily through other cards. Yeah, this one can go the distance. And again, does not feel like the normal yellow decks that we really get, more like the Esper Sisters where events really matter, or a lot of these stun effects or tap down effects that we've seen in like JJK. This really is just, hey, here's some bodies, we're doing some damage, and we're also getting some extra removal on top of it. So as we've seen in previous Union Arena sets, when you have access to more removal, right, you have the 4 special cards as well as the SR, which gives you extra utility, in this case Alice, that can help carry a list quite a bit and make it, a couple tiers higher than some of the other choices. Now we also do have filtering pieces. We have a draw discard, we have a search of your top deck, and then on top of that we also have Memories of 3 Children, the other event I have to give a shout out here too, because it digs 5 cards deep. And as we talked about that kind of disclaimer with Alice and having those consistency issues, you can find those pieces you need off this one card. So it's always hard to know how many events you should be playing in a deck that, have events in them and they matter, like Esper Sisters. But Memories of the 3 Children, absolutely would recommend running at least a 2 of, probably a 3 of, because it's just going to help out so much with your game plan and getting there. And then it's also a draw trigger, which is just really nice to see, right? So again, with this one, it is going to be more of just get your Kirito, Yugo, and Alice to the front line. Kirito is going to get the double attack, which can also combo very, very well the turn you play Alice, right? So an ideal turn is you want to play your Yugo to the front, the turn before. It has impact baked in naturally. It just gets to attack, gets to do its thing. And then on your next turn, you want to do Alice, get to remove something, Kirito, play it to the front line, comes into play, then play Alice, because now you have your 3 cards up front that matter. So you're removing a card, getting a double attack, and if you're able to like promote something as well, right, you're now guaranteed chipping in 2 damage that can go and be very aggressive. And then if you really want to, there's some BP boosting stuff you can play to make sure that Kirito goes up to a 4,500 double attack as well. So there's a lot you can do here, and this is a deck that just from it's a very fair, what I would call like the more fair mid-range style of decks, because it does take, a turn slower than more aggressive strategies. It does have the extra removal baked in with the SRs, and it does have a couple ways to have nullify impact, making sure that if you have to sacrifice something, you can guarantee that you save yourself a point of life and making sure you're getting that one extra turn to crack back. On the other hand, we have Goddess deck, which is all about using your life as a resource and making sure that you're getting down to 3 or even 2 life to get the full effects like the impact and 4K. And this one definitely feels like what we saw with the Boros deck in Red One Punch Man to get down to 2 life and have those effects where your life matters. And we do have the Asuna, which is all things considered, just a worse Boros. Yes, it does have the color trigger, which is good for the sake of getting the color triggers in the deck. But with the Boros, right, we would rather just draw the 2 extra cards and discard a card just to increase the consistency overall. But it is what it is. This deck came out much earlier in Union Arena's life cycle, and that's why we see kind of the pull back and forth between the North American comparisons versus where it was at in the Japan meta and what have you. So the Goddess deck revolving around Shinon, Leafa, and Asuna, again, is all about chipping down your life total, making sure that you're under 4 life to get the various effects, but really 2 or less life is where you want to be. So this deck really powers up over time. But the other thing I will note is it just has 4K attackers, which, again, that is the magic BP breakpoint in Union Arena. So you just get to attack sometimes, and that can be perfectly fine. However, as you're building this deck, you'll notice that there's just clearly stuff missing that we do get in Volume 2. And so I had to give it up to Yugo. So yeah, he's a 4K impact. The rest of his text doesn't really matter. This is much more like the purple bleach deck that's all about just slamming 4Ks that sometimes get an extra effect if you raid them. That's kind of where this one more ends up, unfortunately. Now, yes, you do want to raid as much as possible still in this deck because the effects are very good. And especially like Shinon cannot get to 4K unless you raid it, where this card can be, you know, a little bit of a drawback in that regard. But for some of the other cards, like you will play this deck and just play a vanilla 4K early sometimes because your life total is still healthy, but you want to be aggressive and you need to be attacking. So sometimes playing the 4K Asuna or just playing the 4K Hugo up front is just what you have to do. And sometimes just attacking with 4K vanillas is good enough. Again, however, I think from all 6 of the Sword Art Online decks overall, this one is by far the most incomplete, at least compared to its Volume 2 comparison. So if you want to be playing something in yellow, I would definitely recommend the one I've talked about previous to this, or you're doing more of a hybrid situation where you can maybe slot in a couple of the Goddess cards to round out the Knights deck. But the Knights deck, again, because it is so greedy in what it wants to be doing, it does really require that full board setup and doesn't have as much room as you'd really like, where the hybrid approach in this case is probably going to be just with Yugo synthesis in this end and, you know, waiting for Goddesses to get a little bit better. But with that out of the way, those are the 6 decks. And now let's talk about everybody's favorite part, the expected meta breakdown or prediction, at least of where things are going to be at. So yes, the one disclaimer I will always add is A tier in this case is really tier 1.5. As we get more sets, it really does feel like we have to start adding in that like 1.5 delineation because yes, Sword Art Online Blue definitely feels a lot worse in our North American meta compared to what we had in the Japan format, that it does not feel right putting this at tier 2. However, it also feels a little bit awkward within tier 1 that, you know, these aren't ranked in order left to right, but if we were to look at this tier 1.5 category, Blue SAO is by far the worst in this category, and it's not close. Like, I would even take the purple bleach deck above it, you know, if only slightly, just because it does have a couple more pieces that allows it to do what it wants to be doing. But then ultimately, like, red Speed of Sound and yellow Demon Slayer are like the 1.25 out of the 1.5 category, right? Like those two need to be in their own category while they are strictly behind these deck lists. Above here, they are above the blue SAO and purple bleach, but you know, these 2 decks are well above the other lists. So yes, the one that I got to talk about now until forever, green Sword Art Online is going to be insane in a control heavy meta and has everything that you would want to have in a best of 1 style of deck. The most consistency you can ask for in the top of deck searchers, the most draw you could be asking for in the extra Kirito as well as the special, which is going to draw you a card. It just is, it's a blue deck. I don't know how else to keep saying this other than it is literally a blue deck, and I don't know why it's green other than it looks appealing on the card itself. And we already had 2 good decks in blue to talk about, but it's a blue deck. I don't know any other way to say it. Which then does bring the question of how does it stack up against Kurapika and Lancelot, which are more traditional super late game style of decks in Union Arena, or even Green One Punch Man, but that's its own category, right, in style of decks. And yes, it is a turn faster, or maybe even 2 turns faster than both of these decks, but it does have even more consistency pieces to it that, and again, in a best of 1 setting, if I'm going to be playing a green deck, it's probably going to be Shinon out of all 4 of these in the tier 1 category. And yes, now that we are a bit of time later into the One Punch Man being in the format, I still very strongly believe, all these decks are tier 1. Speed of Sound is 1.5. I think this is going to be our new go-to de facto staple of what is a aggressive deck in the format. Much like Kurapika is going to be the checkpoint for late game style of decks, Speed of Sound is now going to be our new aggro, baseline that every other aggro deck coming out is going to be checked against. And if it can't match or be better than that speed, it's automatically going to be a tier lower. And then, of course, the other decks that I got to talk about in tier 2. And again, tier 2, there's a lot of decks in this category, but I want to be very clear, like tier 2 is still top 8 material and potentially winning if it is able to hit the right matchups or get a little bit lucky. So I know it can look potentially bad that all of these decks are in B, and I just put all 4 of those Sword Art Online decks in the tier 2. Maybe some of them should be tier 2.5. Personally, I need to do a little bit more testing with them, but I really didn't want to break it out any more than that. And yes, I do strongly believe all 4 of those decks are still above the rest of these below. And then, of course, we have some other decks that are getting Volume 2 support. We have JJK coming out soon. We know Hunter x Hunter is getting Volume 2 support. Demon Slayer is going to be getting more support. So I'm expecting some of these to really break more into that 1.5 category for the North American market. But at least for right now, this is my overall prediction for where things stand. And again, we have regionals coming up very, very soon. So I'm excited to see where that lands. So with that out of the way, let me know, what is your favorite deck from Sword Art Online, and where do you put your favorite deck on this tier list? Definitely let me know in the comments below. But otherwise, as I mentioned, we have some Sword Art Online versus videos coming up very, very soon. I'm still trying to recover from my Japan trip and making sure that I'm staying on top of everything, doing my absolute best, but it's been a lot of work in a very few amount of days that I've been back, but we're going to keep with it as much as we can. So make sure to like and subscribe for future Union Arena content. But until next time, my friends, stay safe, stay hydrated, and we'll see you in the next one. Cheers.